Hello to everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Matthew Bishop, and I'd just like everyone to be on mute for now, if we can, except for Don and myself. I am just outside New York, where it is lunchtime, 12:30. Don, where are you?
I am in Palo Alto, so where it is still breakfast.
Still breakfast, excellent.
Still having my coffee.
And I know people have had people in Europe and Asia have been going on various webinars today that Catalyzing Change has been hosting, and that they've been, I think, very interesting. I've already been on one earlier that was a great discussion. So looking forward to this conversation, Don. I was just thinking that we first met for breakfast in New York about a year ago, when you were just after you were announced as the new president of the Skoll Foundation, and we were then talking about systems change, and I guess some of the challenges of coming in to be president of a foundation, and that you'd be spending some time thinking about that. And then I guess you've been thinking about your new strategy, and then suddenly within your first year, you've had to cancel your physical convening that had been a lot of work, and switch to a virtual one, which I think many of us took part in and was a great success. And now you're also trying to make sense of how COVID-19 and its implications will affect your strategy. So we're going to touch on that in this conversation, but also, which normally I guess is a blessing for a foundation leader, but given the circumstances, may have been also a bit of an additional challenge, is you've been given an extra 100 million to deploy this year, I think, and so
yeah,
tripling the amount of money. And I know that's also, doing that in a thoughtful and effective way is going to be a great challenge. So a lot of issues that we can touch on, and I'm going to propose that we talk for a little bit, and then I'm encouraging people that if they want to ask a question, they put that on the chat function of this Zoom call, and then we'll talk for 25 minutes or so, and then maybe half an hour, and then go into a Q&A for the rest of our time together, if that's okay with you. But first of all, great. First of all, Don, I mean, how are you finding this job?
I mean, the job is an incredible. There's a Hawaiian word, kuleana, that means privilege and responsibility simultaneously, and I definitely am feeling that in this moment, and was feeling it before, but it even more so today. I think we're, all of us at the Skoll Foundation are incredibly blessed to have Jeff, who's been warning us all about the risks of pandemics for a very long time, and created ending pandemics and the movie Contagion, and he really has seen this as a moment to that is a defining moment for society globally, and he's actually quadrupled already the size of the granting we'll do this year.
And it's interesting. I mean, I wonder how he's feeling, because I mean, Bill Gates has already been sort of agonizing that he wishes he'd done even more than he did. And I mean, does Jeff feel, I mean, he obviously did so much in raising awareness of pandemics. Is there a feeling that what else could he have done, or is he just sort of frustrated that the world didn't take more notice? And
I think he's focused on trying, as are we, to not look backward but look forward. And in this moment, how do we really accomplish? How do we bend the curve on this current pandemic? How do we make sure that coming out of this, we create the global health system strengthening that's required to make sure that there's never another pandemic? There's effectively, Tom Friedman and others have done research on what it would cost to prevent a future pandemics if we put in place the right infrastructure. And I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's a lot less than the aircraft carriers we produce every year. And I think we've seen the devastating consequences of this. And it goes so far, so I think very much focused on preventing the impacts of this at this moment, and how do we bend the curve on this this pandemic, but also how do we put in place systems and processes that prevent future pandemics. And a lot of our investments that we're making at this moment, we really are doing with both those lenses of how does it make an impact in the moment, but also these are sort of, every one of the investments we've made, we believe leans into what the future systems should look like.
And I mean, you mentioned systems change in the context of health, but I think when we were first talking, I mean, you were thinking more system change across the entire spectrum, you know, maybe in the context of the SDGs, and that was certainly the impulse that led to Catalyst 2030 being established. How does COVID for you alter both the, you know, you've talked about a sprint and a marathon. How does it alter both of those and the priorities when we think about long-term system change, and how much you have to do the short-term stuff now that's different to systems change, or is it all part of systems change, and which particular systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very complicated question. The sprint is how do you address the incredible human consequences of this in this moment, and we're making a number of grants in that context. It's also making sure that, and we have talked publicly about this, that, you know, we've made investments in incredible social entrepreneurs that are part of our community over the last 20 years. How do we make sure they survive as many of them as possible through this period? So we're planning, and we'll sort of ask for advice from the community more broadly in the next few days on sort of what type of targeted emergency funding can we provide to support grantees through this period so that they can realize their potential on the other end of this pandemic. That's also part of our sprint. The marathon is, you know, I believe that we will face a moment here where governments around the world are going to look at these systems very differently. That doesn't guarantee a positive improvement. I think we all have to come together. It's one of the things that excites me so much about Catalyst 2030 and a number of other initiatives that I've seen, because I believe that there is a moment to reimagine economic systems, health systems. I think we're already seeing threats to democracy both here in the US and around the world that hopefully we can make the right system changes to prevent, so that we have a free and fair election here in the US, that democratic spaces are not closed around the world. So I think every one of the systems that we look at, including, by the way, the climate may be getting a little bit of a break during this crisis, but we all know that when the economy returns, the climate crisis is sort of a slow motion version of the pandemic in terms of the economic and social and environmental impacts. So we're looking at how do we invest in those systems over the long term. That's the marathon. And I do think, you know, if you look at the government stimulus package here in the US, it's the biggest social program created since actually it's bigger than the Great Depression at this point. And they're just beginning. So there's opportunities to reshape all this, but forces that are less progressive will be pushing on the other end. So coming together and designing solutions and thinking through how we advocate for those solutions will be critical.
We'll talk about the short-term priorities first, then maybe some of those big long-term issues. And just generally, I know the Gates Foundation has talked about how the whole of the work of the foundation is really now pivoted around COVID. I mean, is that how you feel at the moment with Skull as well?
Yeah, I mean, we're, you know, bringing a COVID lens to everything we do, but COVID has shown us the people who suffer the most are the most marginalized communities around the world, whether in the US or in, you know, any of the global South countries. And so there's an economic component to this, there's a health component. a lot of what Jeff is having us focus on right now with the most recent 100 million is both how do we make sure, how do we work on ways to get the appropriate equipment to the global south that can help mitigate the impacts of the disease, as well as looking at the testing and contact tracing that's going to be critical both in the US and around the world, and making investments that are catalytic in that. So those are the two big focus areas within COVID. We'd already made a number of grants to extend contact tracing, et cetera, into Africa. But the speed at which we're looking at stuff and moving grants out the door, it's hard for even me to keep up with it, and I have to approve them all.
And I mean, I know there's been some reporting in the philanthropy press about the OSI at the moment, and whether the staff seem unhappy a bit that some of the grants that they'd promised before COVID may be in question now. You seem to be very much emphasizing honoring your existing grant relationships and really trying to strengthen your existing grantees.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we, along with a number of foundations, have committed to not only honoring our commitments, but offering flexibility if people need to move money that was supposed to be in next year into this year, or removing grant restrictions. We've always believed in unrestricted granting, but we've made it even more unrestricted and removed reporting requirements, et cetera, wherever people have asked. So we're really we're trusting in those closest to the problems to figure out how to use the resources most effectively, and have been providing small grants quickly with emergency funding to people who need it, and then designing this larger funding program that we'll be asking our community about for our existing grantees here in the next few days.
I mean, looking at some of the changes you've made in the way the grants are going to be handled, it sort of made me smile a bit, because I think about what social entrepreneurs have been saying for many years about how grant making institutions operate anyway, with far too many restrictions and not enough, sort of core funding and freedom to the social entrepreneurs. I mean, do you think you might stick with this way of funding going forward, or is this just an emergency measure?
No, most of our funding has been unrestricted, so this is sort of leaning into something we were already doing, and I imagine will continue. There's certain times where, in some settings that doesn't make sense, but the majority of our granting is unrestricted and will continue to be.
And of this 100 million that Jeff has added to your giving this year, how much of that is already in your mind allocated, and how much is still, really there to be just find good ideas to back? And
the majority is not yet allocated, and Jeff has said publicly that the 100 isn't the limit. That he expects to spend 500 this year across all of his the Jeff Skoll Group entities, so the foundation, the participant in Capricorn. So where we see catalytic opportunities to make a difference, he's willing to support those, and hopefully this also lead others to join in those responses.
And I was just touch on the marathon aspects of this in the long term. I mean, obviously this crisis at the moment, we're really in the early stage of the health aspect of it. Arguably a lot more to come on that front, rather depressingly, in the developing world, having started mostly in some of the more developed or spread out of China, mostly into sort of some of the richer nations. But also then we have the economic crisis that's going to almost certainly follow. I mean, how are you thinking about those two tracks, and how what you're going to look for from philanthropy, and what it's reasonable to expect of others, government and beyond, in terms of how much they're going to have the capacity to do anything that needs to be done, and how much is going to have to be done by the social entrepreneur, and private philanthropy and business sectors?
I mean, the scale of both the economic and health challenge can't be addressed without government. So look at help and therefore social entrepreneurs, as they always have, can be at the forefront. But in the end, the scale of these problems goes beyond Jeff and Bill Gates and everybody else's checkbooks added up together. You look at the size of the stimulus packages that are coming out, not just in the US, but around the world. And it's clear that this is a moment where good ideas are going to be sought after, and hopefully governments around the world will adopt some of these. We're also, the organization One is one of our grantees, and they're working very hard on trying to make sure that the global South is not forgotten in this crisis, and that that the right investments are made over the long term from governments around the world into countries that have less resources to respond to both the health and economic impacts of this. So we're sort of fighting on all fronts here.
I mean, obviously, from an economic policy perspective, I mean, there are no rules here, and people are making it up as they go along. I mean, given your background also in your experience of being in government, how do you think philanthropy and social purpose can help in that respect?
I mean, I think, and I'm obviously the most familiar with the US, but having the right ideas, there are going to be people, this will be a moment where if you're there at the right time and get to the right person, ideas can be adopted at a speed we've never seen before. And in the US context, we'll have an election in November, and hopefully it'll be a free and fair one. And so new ideas are being sought right now for how to move forward in this next period that, I think could help us redefine some of these issues in ways that we haven't before. And entrepreneurs, with their ideas and coming together in community, can help shape some of those responses.
So you've been a very early and committed supporter of the Catalyst 2030 initiative. And I wondered, firstly, what attracted you to this initiative? And then I'll have a couple of follow-up questions after that.
I think it speaks to exactly what I was just talking about. It's going to take, too often I'm quoting someone else, but we're winning a lot of battles and not winning the wars. This was before COVID. Now it's even more true in this context. I think the more social entrepreneurs can come together with a common vision, and the better chance of shaping government response, the better chance of getting resource. And that's what excites me about Catalyst 2030 at the beginning. And as it's developed, and it's a reason we were so excited about sponsoring it early on. The challenge of something like this is we're in this virtual world, world of social distancing that we're living in. But I do, having been a policymaker and knowing a number of them, they're getting assaulted by 1,000 ideas. That you should do this, you should do that. And the more that there's coherence and a overall plan, that the better chance of government listening and adopting and scaling.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously the initial 2030 impetus was around the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So are they still relevant in a post-COVID world, or are they just have we now been set back so far that they're sort of out of reach?
Well, relevance has two components to it. One is your question, they're certainly still relevant. Whether the timeline is going to have been pushed back by the economic and medical consequence of this, I think is a very important question. The relevance has never been higher. I think COVID, has just shined such a spotlight on the need. One, that we are all one interconnected world, and that disease in one part of the world affects people all around the world. And if we haven't learned, hopefully the world will take that lesson away from all the other various global challenges we face. My concern, honestly, is there's equally more xenophobic, more nationalist, more closing down of borders. It's as I look at it from the where we sit at the Skull Foundation, finding efforts that can help break down that siloed thinking and realize that we really have to imagine a different world and not retreat, but go forward, I think is going to be critical.
A couple of questions more about Catalyst 2030. One is, how do you want to engage with this community going forward? What's the best way for a foundation that's committed to this kind of change like you are to hear from social entrepreneurs and for...
You mean besides the daily phone calls Drew makes to us at the foundation?
Yes. Yes.
This is not a shy
no community.
We hear from all of you. I think, by the way, I was describing this about government before, remembering we at Skull are a small staff now spread across a number of initiatives as we try and figure out how to best put the incredible resources that Jeff has given us to work. So the more Catalyst 2030 groups speak as one voice, the better it will be for us in terms of helping us figure out how to support you and as a group going forward. And I think, showing us so we can go to our board, these are the tangible plans we have to make a difference in this moment will be critical. In the Catalyst plan.
And a question before we go to the questions that people have sent in, and I know some of you we're having some difficulty sometimes hearing all that Don is saying because I think you've had a slightly dodgy internet connection, but we're getting the gist of it. Yeah, we're getting the gist of it.
In Palo Alto, I will speak louder. Just give me a thumbs up, Matt, if I'm not talking loud enough.
Sure. No, I think it's just sometimes the reception itself is not working. But before we turn to the questions that have come in, I think as we talk about systems change and the kind of big joined up thinking, silo busting changes that are going to be needed, donors, some donors, a few donors have really embraced this, but most haven't. I mean, you scholars obviously talked about this. You're a part of Co-Impact, which is one of these collaborative platforms and so forth. But it's actually, the Giving Pledge, my sense is lots of people have signed the pledge, but there's not a lot of this yet really effective concerted action around donors mobilizing their money to really drive systemic change. What can be done to change that in your mind? Assuming you agree with my diagnosis, I mean,
I think it's a mix. I think there are a number of funders who are moving this way and more every day, and there's tremendous amount of new philanthropy. Now, it's hard to tell post-COVID how the world of philanthropy will be shaped, but I think it again is highlighting the need for these systemic changes. And philanthropists here in California or in other parts of the country are seeing these food lines in a country where you wouldn't have thought that was going to be what we were seeing. That points for a need to change the system because, again, no philanthropy is big enough to meet all the needs that are being unmet, and this disease is highlighted. So I'm hopeful, optimistic that it will help drive even more change.
And as you look
Somebody says I'm covering the mic, so I saw
yes,
that.
there you go.
So.
There you go.
Is that better?
I think so, a little bit. There's a question from Barbara Weber, and I mean the gist of it is, there's lots of other people are making announcements, a lot of other wealth holders, to increase their giving during this COVID crisis. Are you seeing most of that going in to systemic type changes, or is it mostly alleviating short-term stuff? And are you all working together?
It's a mix of what we're seeing in terms of, there are many foundations that are increasing their giving, and they're doing it in areas that fit with where their expertise is. So, Gates is leading made various serious commitments here, and is leading much of the research in contributing to vaccines, among other things. Open Society announced another 130 million, very much focused on working with the most marginalized and supporting them through this. So in terms of philanthropists working together, we're trying, but things are moving so quickly. We're part of a number of groups that are trying to collaborate, share ideas, and doing our best to stay coordinated as we can. But it's a tough challenge. There's so much change happening so quickly. And, on the flip side, there are also a number of foundations whose endowments suffered along with the economic downturn. And I think they're trying to figure out how to meet their commitments. And some their boards have to decide whether to spend into their endowments or not.
And is there any advice you have to social entrepreneurs and other nonprofits as they're looking to sort of approach foundations during this time? And Jim Fruchterman has asked, as this has become increasingly clearly a crisis that's going to affect every part of life, is every nonprofit social entrepreneur going to have to make the case again for why the need for what we do on all these issues is up 50 to 100% because of COVID-19, and should we be reapplying for COVID-19 related grants?
The answer is hard to give advice because there's so many different approaches that different nonprofits are taking to this. I think what we're looking for is people who are trying to figure out how can they be catalytic in this moment? How can they really drive the type of systems change that is going to be critical both in this moment and post-COVID? And I think across the philanthropic field, all of the foundation heads that I've talked to are trying to say, how do we take our scarce resources and best apply them to and fill holes, actually, that government is not filling until government steps up and does what they need to do. And I think, the biggest single surprise that's come out of COVID is, for us and others, the US response and the Western European response has pointed out, we didn't expect to have to be spending resources in the US or in Europe on the health side, much less the economic and social side. And I think that has put a strain on everybody as we try and figure out how to move forward through this.
Yeah, I mean, this really leads directly into the next question from Megan Fellow, which is, is there a growing understanding that the balance between health and economic social support in the North versus the global South, is how that needs to shift? And I guess, as you say, I mean, the first response really has been actually that more money is being focused in the global north than perhaps was anticipated, although, I think there were signs, and obviously in America it's been a long-running concern that the healthcare for a large part of the population isn't very good. But I mean, do you fear that we retrench too much to the north when in fact what we should be doing is channeling much more into the south at this point?
I definitely think that's a risk. I think it's part of why we're so committed to trying to think globally at this moment and make investments that really catalyze global responses and advocate for that. Particularly around pandemics, you cannot solve a pandemic by looking inward. You need that global system of health and economic strengthening. If you're this moment to hopefully reimagine some of these systems and influence policymakers to do the same.
Yeah. There's a question about a specific policy, and I don't want to get too sidetracked into this, but let's have an answer if you have a quick answer on this. But is this the time? This is from Indra. Is this the time for universal basic income with a requirement to move into citizen action networks of mutual aid?
Yeah, I'm not the policy expert on that, but it certainly has gained credence in the U.S. UBI has, and I think it is also it's the quickest response. Whether it'll become a long-term policy in the U.S., I'm not sure, but it certainly will be a part of the debate. And Andrew Yang's done a good job of putting it on the radar as a key component, and so we'll see where that one heads.
The next question is one I have an interest in this from Roseberg Jones' daughter. Here in Iceland, we're using Social Progress Index as a way to localize SDG measurement in several communities. How do you see the role of data in systems change and in delivering the SDGs and navigating this COVID crisis?
Well, data in COVID is key, and it's what we're lacking. It's part of why we're looking at investing in serologic testing, because without that, we don't have the data to understand the progress of the disease. And first of all, we need good tests. As those of you who followed this will know that the majority of the tests that have been approved actually are not effective. So there's an effort going on right now to try and make sure that first we find the right tests and then we collect the right data. Until we have that, we're not going to be able to address, until we have that and a vaccine or a treatment. We can open up the economy, but we're going to be right back where we were, and medically, and therefore the economic pain will continue. The data is essential, and I think using that, one hope we have out of this is the belief in data and in science. Hopefully the world will take a lesson from COVID, that we need to listen to the science and use the data to try and understand these problems and drive to solutions.
While we're on that, what's your sort of hunch as how long we're going to be in this phase of just literally trying to put in place the testing infrastructure and also finding the basic treatments and vaccines?
Hopefully, I wish I were smart enough to predict that, because it would make we're lucky enough to be able to have people like Larry Brilliant on our board, who is the team at Ending Pandemics, talking to us. And I think and have Jeff, who's following this as closely as anyone in the world. The truth is, none of us know. You know,
But you're thinking more years than months for sure. Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, what we said at the beginning, I think is still true. The typical time for a vaccine is 12 to 18 months. We have to figure out, you know, one of the biggest issues around a vaccine is going to be how it gets distributed. We would obviously advocate for distributing it in both an equitable way, but also one that bends the curve on the disease most quickly. There will be many forces fighting back against that. And that will be a great global debate that will go on. And same thing with treatments. As treatments are developed, and hopefully there will be some successful ones, that also will indicate how fast we can go back to work, how comfortable people are opening up businesses, etc. This is the thing about this pandemic is every day we're surprised. We don't actually even understand how the disease works in the human body to the extent that we should at this point. So making predictions is very hard.
And what do you personally worry is the important issue that is most in danger of being neglected because we've switched our focus to COVID?
Boy, I wish I could pick one, because COVID is so all-encompassing that I think it exacerbates or highlights every issue that's that the foundation and many of our social entrepreneurs have been working on. You know, whether it's the spike in gender-based violence or the closing down of democratic space or economic inequality, or you know, I could go down the list. It's devastating, and the biggest concern I have is that we don't learn the lessons of this disease, not we as people on this phone call, but governments around the world, and that they think the answer is close down our borders, look inward, and try and rebuild the old systems rather than using this as an opportunity to redesign systems in an equitable way that benefits all of us.
Yeah. So I've got probably two questions I want to take before we wrap up, and then as a final question, Don, I really want to ask you to challenge this group. You know, what is it? What will be your challenge to them as social entrepreneurs at this time? But the two questions leading into this, one is from Valeria Marino, which is really relating to the fact that obviously there is a massive economic crisis coming, and you know, in many ways, parts of the economy that were there pre-COVID because of how we're going to change our behaviors is not going to be there when we get back. And it really touches on that. Obviously, Jeff and many of the other new big philanthropists of this time made their money in business. They are, you know, supportive of for-profit entrepreneurship in all sorts of interesting ways. Should they be prioritizing just making capital available and investing in that job creating process and supporting small and medium-sized businesses much more than has been part of the agenda over the last few years?
It's a very interesting question, and it's part of why Jeff, you know, why as we look at the next sort of 300 million he's talked about publicly, he hasn't committed it to the foundation yet. And, you know, Jeff has 3 platforms: Capricorn, which is the sort of investment, is the investment platform; Participant, which is uses the power of narrative to create social change. And I think we're going to explore all 3, or Jeff is going to explore where can he make the biggest difference. You know, it's to the point that the question raised, like in the US, if you look at industries that may never return to operating the same way they were. It's about 30% of the jobs in the U.S. That are in some way or form or another require people to be congregated in small spaces. And that's a huge economic impact. So trying to rethink some of those industries could have as big a social benefit if we can figure out how to get people back to work. So I think it is one of the things across the Jeff Skoll Group we will be looking at.
Great, and then a couple of questions around the mechanics of systems change. One is from Rana Tijani. So what processes are being explored to adopt a bottom-up approach to systems change? And then from Sasha Gayama, systems change means early collaboration, which can come at a cost, real or opportunity cost, which many non-profits can find hard to afford or justify internally. Are Skoll and other systems change donors open to funding early co-creation collaborative costs?
The answer to the second one is we have done that historically and will continue to. And, as we look at systems change, we think one of the pieces of our new strategy is trying to bring an equity lens to all we do and looking for proximate leaders who are have the lived and learned experience of the problems we're trying to address. So we also very much believe in the bottoms up all the way up to the policy change. I think it's one of the challenges of systems change is all the way from sort of the roots of the tree where the inequity started all the way up to the top and the policies and the normative change needed for systems change. We are looking for opportunities. Now, again, we have to figure out where we can be most catalytic. So that's the other lens we bring to it. Where our money can have the biggest impact.
Yeah, and I guess, and Steve Podmore has just added, actually in contrast to the bottom-up approach, what about funding new, much larger and systemic catalytic models of impact investment?
We will look at both and try and figure out where we see the biggest impact, recognizing and if you look at historically who our awardees have been, they've been a mix of people who started at that sort of very high level system to those who are working sort of in the most proximate from the bottoms up. And I would imagine we would still continue to have a mix as we move through this period.
Great. Well, I want to come to this last question, which is really a chance for you. I mean, you've had a lot of engagement with this community, the community of social entrepreneurs at Skoll, and now through the Catalyst 2030 initiative, and you've had Giroux and many others bending your ear and sharing their experiences and whatever. What's your challenge to them as you think about like how on earth do we, take on this enormous challenge that we're all facing together at this time? What do you need from this community, and what's your challenge to us to raise our game?
I think it's a combination of clarity in how you think. First of all, one of the things that's been so exciting and given me hope in a period of incredible trauma in the world is watching all of our community broadly, the Catalyst 2030, the Skoll awardees, rush to the fire rather than rush away from the fire, and figure out how to pivot their business models in a period of social distancing, be creative in how they're trying to address these problems. And, I've been so inspired by any number of stories, and we're if you go on our website, you can see examples of what we've seen out in the community, and are so proud of the efforts that all of you are making. I think the more that social entrepreneurs can be hard-nosed in figuring out how can I make this and be clear on that. The other thing we and every funder are trying to sift through a huge amount of data that's changing every day. Forward with ideas on why this idea can be catalytic in this moment is going to be critical.
Yeah, we just lost the first part of that. So it's more that social entrepreneurs can be,
brevity and clarity on why this is catalytic in this moment will be critical, because we and every other philanthropist are sorting through a huge amount of data as we're trying to understand the impacts of this and where to place our limited bets. So the more social entrepreneurs think about the system can be clear and help us understand why this is a catalytic change, and why it will succeed in making that change. Or better, we'll be able to move at the speed of the disease, which is sort of the speed we're trying to operate.
And are you particularly interested in groups of people proposing joined up solutions, or is that, whether it's an individual or a group, does that matter very much?
I mean, I think what we're most interested in is how catalytic it will be. I think the more comprehensive the solution, the better, but we also recognize that collaboration without a solution is not adding value at the moment.
Great. Well, look, Don, thank you so much for your time. And sorry we had some slight technical difficulties. I think that we all got the gist of what you had to say, and most of it came through pretty clearly. And it's been a very informative view into what's front of your mind at the moment. This is the first of the Catalyst 2030 Zoomathons, and it's very experimental. But I think, assuming we do more that there are more of these in the future, I think there's a great appetite to have you back and to keep interacting with you and hear how your thinking is evolving and how this relationship with Catalyst 2030 can deepen going forward. So I hope we can welcome you back again.
Great.
Thank you very much.
I would love that, and hopefully Palo Alto will have fixed its internet by then. You'd think in Silicon Valley it would be doing better.
It's a sign of the times.
It's a system that needs to be rethought, I guess. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thanks. And we're back tomorrow with Tim Hanstead as well. So please join us for that session, which I think will be also very thought-provoking. Thank you very much.
Thanks.